The hospital's waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and bitter coffee. I sat beside Lila, my daughter-in-law, watching her smooth the fabric of her dress over her rounded belly. She looked radiant, nervous, in the way expectant mothers always do. And since Marcus, my son, was away on yet another business trip, I had agreed to accompany her to this last checkup. I thought it would be a simple morning, a routine ultrasound, perhaps a glimpse of my first grandchild's profile. Inside the dim room, the sonogram screen glowed blue as Dr. Callum Harris moved the wand across Lila's stomach, his eyes tightening as he measured and remeasured. When he set the device aside and asked me to step into the hall, I felt my chest seize. His voice dropped to a whisper as he explained that the gestational age was clear and that Marcus could not be the father of this child. He urged that my son speak to an attorney, even consider divorce. The words struck like a hammer. Through the small window in the door, I could still see Lila smiling faintly, rubbing her stomach as if nothing was wrong. I forced myself back into the room, lips forming words of encouragement, though my pulse thudded so loudly I thought it might betray me. She thanked me for being there, unaware that her gratitude now weighed like lead. By the time I reached the parking lot, I felt hollowed out. The sterile hallway behind me seemed to echo with decades of memories demanding to be reconsidered under this new light. I had been 22 when I married Anthony. He was tall, confident, ambitious, and I believed his promises of stability and success. With the modest inheritance my father left me, I bought our first duplex. While Anthony bragged about his growing portfolio, I was the one painting walls, meeting inspectors at dawn, and balancing ledgers. Year after year, the pattern repeated with me, keeping everything afloat while Anthony charmed neighbors with tales of triumph. Our son Marcus became my anchor, the bright spot in a life of endless compromise. Anthony, meanwhile, was absent for birthdays and anniversaries, excusing himself with talk of deals that never quite appeared. My sacrifices had built the life we showed the world, yet Anthony treated me not as a partner, but as an obstacle. When Marcus first brought Lila home, I thought a new chapter had begun. She had a shy smile and a warmth in her voice that reminded me of the daughter I had once wished for. At our table, she called me her second mother, and my guarded heart opened. She wanted to learn the property business, asked endless questions, and accepted every lesson with gratitude. One evening, she confessed her difficult childhood in foster care, and I believed her tears when she said, "You're the mother I always prayed for." I gave her more than knowledge. I gave her heirlooms, recipes, even family histories. For the first time in years, I felt less alone, and Marcus adored her, looking at her with a devotion I had once prayed he would give to someone worthy. I told myself the cycle of neglect had ended, but the doctor's words refused to fade. At my desk that night, I compared calendars and receipts. Marcus had been away during the weeks of conception, his flight confirmations and hotel invoices, proof that he could not be the father. My eyes drifted toward Anthony, though I resisted the thought. Yet the receipts in his suit pockets told another story. Dinners for two on River Street, a jewelry store invoice for a bracelet I had never seen, faint traces of perfume clinging to his shirts. Lila's familiarity with details I had not shared, glances between her and Anthony I had once dismissed as nothing, all returned like storm clouds. When I confronted Anthony with the receipts, he laughed me off, calling me paranoid. His dismissal cut deeper than anger. Paranoia, he called it, but the ultrasound and the calendar did not lie. I realized then that silence would be my only ally. I packed a suitcase, left our house on Easton Drive, and rented a small carriage house draped with Spanish moss on the outskirts of town. To neighbors, I said I needed space to focus on paperwork. In truth, I needed air without Anthony's shadow pressing down. It was there in that quiet place that I sought help. Over coffee in a diner, I hired Nathan Cole, a discreet investigator, and laid out the evidence. He promised to uncover what was hidden. Then I turned to Ruth Ellis, an attorney I trusted, who explained the intricacies of Georgia law, equitable distribution, marital property fault clauses. She urged patience to gather proof without rash moves. I agreed. Yet Marcus complicated everything. When he visited, he insisted Lila was simply overwhelmed and urged me not to let suspicion poison me. He showed me a draft of a document she had given him broad powers of attorney, granting her sweeping access to accounts. My heart sank. I placed my hand on his and told him firmly, "Never sign what you do not understand." He left, unconvinced, believing me, blinded by doubt. I watched his car disappear and knew silence must be my weapon until truth revealed itself. Weeks later, Nathan returned with evidence that left no room for denial. Hotel records with Anthony's credit card and Lila's signature photographs of them entering together, bank transfers siphoning tens of thousands from our accounts into one under Lila's name, even a quitclaim deed forged with my name transferring property into Anthony's control. My foresight years earlier to place holdings into a family trust had protected much, but the betrayal was undeniable. I delivered the files to Ruth, who urged me to amend my will to protect Marcus should fraud entangle him. That evening, as the city lights glittered on the river, I resolved to keep playing the devoted wife until the missing financial records arrived, because one wrong move too soon could cost me justice. The mask became my shield, even as inside the weight of their betrayal threatened to crush me. The Saturday I chose to set the stage looked like any other. I invited Marcus and Lila for lunch and told Anthony that Ruth would be joining us to discuss succession matters. He seemed smug, striding into the living room with a folder tucked under his arm, as though he were holding proof of victory. The sunlight streamed across the hardwood as neighbors passed by outside, unaware of the storm about to break inside these walls. I opened with pleasantries, letting Anthony believe he was in control. He pulled out the quitclaim deed I had already seen, declaring with false confidence that the transfer simplified our estate and gave him co-ownership of one of the Jones Street properties. He looked at Marcus, expecting admiration. Instead, Ruth calmly requested the document, adjusted her glasses, and announced that the notarization had expired months before the signature date. "This deed is invalid," she said. Anthony's face drained of color. Before he could recover, Nathan connected his laptop to the television. Images filled the screen. Anthony and Lila slipping into the boutique hotel, dates stamped in the corner, her handwriting on a note that read, "Just a few more months and we'll be free. When the papers move, the rest is ours." Marcus's hands trembled as he looked from his wife to his father. Then Ruth read aloud Dr. Harris's letter, the one stating with clinical precision that the gestational age excluded Marcus as the father. The silence that followed was a suffocating weight. Lila tried tears, insisting love had confused her, but her voice rang hollow. Anthony muttered excuses about loneliness and mistakes, but Marcus rose, voice cracking as he whispered, "I can't defend you anymore." For the first time in decades, Anthony had nothing left to say. I met Ruth's eyes, and together we placed divorce papers and a civil complaint on the table. My voice was steady when I told Anthony they would be filed immediately. That night, after the house emptied in ruin, I sat in my study trembling, yet calm, knowing the hardest part had begun, living with truth no one could deny. The months that followed were consumed by courtroom signatures and the unraveling of a family already frayed. Anthony tried to bluster, claiming rights to property he had never truly owned, but the trust documents and Ruth's filings stripped him bare. When the decree was final, he left with nothing but his tarnished name. Lila's downfall was swift as well. Marcus filed for divorce, supported by Nathan's evidence and Dr. Harris's testimony. The court moved quickly, granting annulment and freeing him from obligations to a child not his. Each time Marcus signed another paper, grief shadowed his eyes, but clarity steadied him. He no longer lived in illusion. I fortified the business, closing every gap I had once left open out of trust. Dual signatures became mandatory accounts, audited quarterly leases filed with redundancies. Caution became its own kind of freedom. Yet victory carried sharp edges. Old friends avoided me in the market whispers, followed me at church. Scandal, even when rooted in truth, stains the survivor as much as the guilty. Still, each evening, as I locked my office, I reminded myself that I was still standing. The empire I had built had not crumbled. My son was free. My dignity, once dismissed as paranoia, had become my shield. In silence, I began to imagine a future without the people who had betrayed me, a life where I could finally breathe. Spring came and softened the edges of scandal. Marcus and I rebuilt not as mother and son alone, but as business partners. We opened a small downtown office with both our names on the door. He handled daily operations while I oversaw legal and financial structures. For the first time, I felt I was passing him something honest. Yet I wanted more than profit to mark this new chapter. I established a scholarship at the Technical College for students in property maintenance dedicated to resilience, the very trait that had carried me through betrayal. Watching the first recipient walk across the stage gave me a satisfaction money never had. Meanwhile, Anthony faded into obscurity, renting a room above a hardware store, his charm worn thin. Lila vanished altogether. Her name whispered no longer at luncheons or committee lists. Their absence was a constant reminder of what had been lost and what I had chosen to preserve. Still, not everything healed. Marcus carried grief that surfaced in quiet moments, and I carried a new wariness etched into my bones. Trust had once been my greatest gift, but now it was a boundary I guarded fiercely. One evening, as the sun bled through the oaks outside our office, I closed the ledger for the quarter, every column balanced, every account clean. I rested my hand on the cabinet, feeling the cool weight of order, and realized that for decades I had carried others on my shoulders, diminished and doubted. Now finally, I had reclaimed myself. The night air smelled of the river, damp and free, and I stepped into it lighter than I had been in years. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm both strange and steady. Marcus came by the office each morning, his tie slightly askew, carrying the weight of heartbreak in his eyes, yet refusing to crumble under it. I admired him more than ever, not because he was unscathed, but because he was learning how to live in truth. He threw himself into the business, meeting tenants, negotiating with contractors, and taking on responsibilities I had once shouldered alone. At first, I hovered, checking every detail, but soon I found myself letting go, allowing him to prove not only his competence, but his integrity. He was nothing like his father. That alone gave me peace. The quiet of my new life contrasted sharply with the years of chaos I had endured. There were no sudden demands for explanations, no unexplained absences, no mocking laughter when I raised concerns. Instead, there were clean books, honest accounts, and mornings that began with black coffee on my balcony, where I could listen to the hum of the city without dread. Yet loneliness pressed at the edges, especially when I thought of the child Lila carried, innocent yet born of betrayal. Marcus avoided the subject, but I knew it weighed on him too. Some nights when the streetlights flickered across his face as we walked home from the office, I saw the unspoken ache of dreams stolen before they had fully formed. Anthony's shadow still lingered in town, though dimmed. I heard whispers of his decline, missed payments, old friends crossing the street to avoid him. Once I saw him across the square, thinner, his hair streaked with gray, his charm spent. For a moment, our eyes met, and I almost felt pity. Almost. He looked away first. That was when I understood he no longer had power over me. The years of compromise, the weight of being dismissed, had ended. What remained was freedom, born from fire. I began reclaiming pieces of myself I had long abandoned. A dusty box of paints emerged from my closet brushes, stiff but still serviceable. I set up a small easel in the sunroom of my apartment and let colors bleed across canvas. At first, the strokes were clumsy, landscapes, blurred flowers too harsh. But each attempt carried me further from the shadows of suspicion. Neighbors began waving when they saw me walking to the farmer's market. Clerks at the bakery greeted me by name. I was no longer defined as Anthony's wife or Lila's mother-in-law. I was Clara again, a woman with her own story. Marcus struggled to rebuild his social life. Friends hesitated, unsure how to approach him after the scandal. One evening, he confessed, voice low, that he wondered if he would ever trust again. I told him trust was not something others granted, it was something he would choose when ready. He nodded silent, but I saw the truth of it settle inside him. We both knew healing would not be quick, but at least it had begun. Ruth, ever practical, reminded me that protection was an ongoing task. "Guard your accounts, Clara," she said. "Betrayal doesn't vanish just because the guilty have faded." I took her advice, layering safeguards into every corner of the business. Yet I also refused to let fear dictate everything. Life had already stolen too many years of joy. When Marlene, an old friend I had neglected, invited me to a concert, I said yes without hesitation. Sitting beside her in the warm glow of the theater, listening to the pianist I had once missed because of family obligations, I felt tears prick my eyes. This time, I was fully present. No excuses, no babysitting. Just me choosing joy. Anthony and Lila's names still carried sting in the community. Some people whispered behind closed doors. Others judged from afar, but gradually their absence became less of a wound and more of a scar visible. Yes, but no longer painful to touch. Marcus stopped reacting when someone mentioned them, and I stopped explaining myself. We owed no one our story. The truth, after all, was carved in records and court decrees in the silence left behind. One spring afternoon, I walked the shoreline near Tybee, the same stretch of ocean I had once dreamed of fleeing to. The waves tugged at my ankles, cold and steady, and I realized I no longer needed to run. The ocean lived inside me now, a rhythm of resilience, a reminder that boundaries could be as firm as tides. Love, I understood, was never meant to demand self-erasure. Real love made space for respect. Without it, all that remained was hunger disguised as devotion. As the sun sank low, casting gold across the water, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. Never again would I surrender so completely. My time, my voice, my dignity, they were mine to protect. For the first time, the words did not feel like defiance. They felt like truth. Summer arrived with its heavy savanna heat draping the streets in sunlight that shimmered off the river. Life no longer felt like survival. It began to feel like choice. Marcus thrived in the office, his confidence growing with every successful negotiation, and I allowed myself to watch with pride rather than fear. He had endured betrayal, yet instead of bitterness, he chose discipline, honesty, and steady work. Some evenings as we locked the office together, I saw in him the man I had once hoped Anthony would be. That thought no longer stung. It simply reminded me of how far we had come. But healing was not without its shadows. At the market, I sometimes overheard whispers, neighbors still clinging to scandal, muttering about Celeste's disappearance, about Anthony's decline. The words no longer pierced me as they once had. Instead, I felt a kind of distant sadness for people who found comfort in gossip rather than growth. Their voices faded quickly compared to the laughter I rediscovered at book clubs, the warmth of evenings with Marlene, or the quiet satisfaction of finishing another painting. My canvases grew bolder, full of bright strokes that carried no trace of fear. Visitors who saw them remarked on their vibrancy, surprised that someone who had lived through such betrayal could still find beauty. They didn't realize that painting was how I proved to myself that light always returned. Anthony dwindled into obscurity. Rumors placed him in a rented room above a hardware store. His debts mounting, his circle vanished. Once I passed him on a quiet street. His suit was rumpled, his gait uncertain. He looked at me as though hoping for recognition, perhaps even forgiveness. I gave him neither. My silence was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. He turned away first, and I walked on with my head high. Lila, meanwhile, vanished entirely. No one knew where she had gone. Marcus never spoke her name again, though sometimes, when he thought I wasn't watching, I saw grief flicker across his face like a shadow of what might have been. I established rituals that anchored me. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, where I lingered over tomatoes just because I could. Evenings on my narrow balcony with a glass of wine and the hum of cicadas. Sunday afternoons painting wildflowers that grew along the roadside. Each small act of choice reminded me that freedom was not always grand. Sometimes it was simply being able to decide how to spend an hour without explanation. For years, my life had been dictated by others' needs. Now it was guided by my own. Marcus and I grew closer in ways that surprised me. Without Anthony's shadow, our conversations deepened. We spoke not only of ledgers and tenants, but of dreams, regrets, and the kind of legacy worth leaving. He admitted his fear that betrayal might shape him forever. I told him scars do not define us. How we choose to carry them does. He listened, and in his silence, I saw him beginning to believe it. Our partnership became more than business. It became a rebuilding of family, not the illusion of family we had once pretended to be. By autumn, the scandal had dulled into background noise. At church, pews no longer shifted away from me. At the market, neighbors nodded again. People seemed to realize that survival carried its own kind of dignity, and slowly respect replaced judgment. It was not universal, but it was enough. And even if it hadn't been, I no longer measured myself by their approval. My worth had never lived in their eyes. It lived in the strength that had carried me through. One evening, Marcus came to me with an idea. He wanted to start a scholarship in my name at the technical college for students pursuing property restoration. "You've always said resilience is what matters," he told me. "Let's honor that." Tears stung my eyes as I nodded. At the first award ceremony, watching a young woman cross the stage with her head held high, I felt a pride deeper than profit. This was legacy, not money alone, but the passing on of resilience, the very quality that had saved me. Life had shifted. Where once I had been dismissed as paranoid, I now stood as proof that silence, patience, and resolve could dismantle lies. My story was not one of ruin, but of reclamation. As winter settled in, I found myself at peace with the rhythm of evenings spent painting, mornings spent working, and afternoons spent simply being present. For decades, I had carried the weight of others' choices. Now, finally, I carried only my own. Winter arrived with its muted skies and damp chill, but instead of heaviness, it carried a strange calm. For the first time in decades, the holidays were not frantic performances to mask Anthony's absences or Lila's schemes. They were quiet mornings with coffee evenings with Marcus by the fireplace and the occasional laughter of friends who no longer pitied me, but respected me. The silence that once felt oppressive had transformed into sanctuary. I no longer feared being alone. I had learned to fill the space with choices that were mine alone. Yet, even in calm shadows sometimes reached for me. Letters arrived from my parents full of admonitions about family duty, as though they had forgotten the depth of betrayal I had endured. "You are always the glue," my mother wrote. "What will people think if you abandon that role." I read the words, then folded the letter neatly into a drawer without response. I had spent a lifetime living by what others thought. I no longer would. Their expectations were chains, and I had broken free. Marcus understood, though he carried his own burdens quietly. Sometimes he lingered at the office long after hours, as though afraid of returning to an empty home. One night, I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "Grief fades when you allow joy to return. Don't mistake survival for living." He nodded, and though his smile was faint, it was real. Anthony's decline reached me in fragments, rumors of unpaid debts, whispers of health failing. I never sought confirmation. His life no longer intersected with mine, and that was freedom in itself. Lila remained a ghost, her name fading from conversations as though she had never existed. The child she carried would have been born by then, but I knew nothing of it. A part of me ached for that innocence, yet I reminded myself that not every wound was mine to heal. Marcus had made his choice, and I respected it. Sometimes, love meant letting go of what poisoned you, even when it left scars. I continued to paint my canvases, growing brighter, filled with wide skies and oceans that stretched endlessly. When neighbors visited, they often lingered in front of them, surprised at their vibrancy. "These look like freedom," one remarked. I smiled because that was exactly what they were. Each brushstroke was proof that beauty could rise even from betrayal, that resilience was not only about enduring, but about creating anew. My scholarship expanded, funded by small but steady profits. Each time a student stood on stage, diploma in hand, I felt a quiet joy ripple through me. Resilience was being passed forward one life at a time. By spring, I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked the shoreline at Tybee again, waves foaming around my ankles, and understood something deeply: my life had not ended with betrayal. It had begun. For too long, I had believed love required self-erasure, that sacrifice was the price of belonging. But true love honors boundaries, makes space for dignity, and never demands silence in the face of harm. My marriage to Anthony, my trust in Lila, those had been illusions built on hunger and deceit. What endured was the strength I had found when everything else collapsed. Standing there with the salt wind in my hair, I realized the truest inheritance I could leave Marcus was not property or profit, but the example of a life reclaimed. To anyone who would listen, my story was not one of bitterness, but of resilience, of choosing to honor yourself, even when others call it selfish. If there was one lesson carved into my bones, it was this: dignity is not granted by others. It is chosen, claimed, and protected, no matter who tries to take it away. So, if you've stayed with me through this journey, thank you. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment to support more stories like this, because sometimes the most powerful legacy is not the wealth we leave behind, but the courage we show when we finally take our life back.